Welcome, John.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited because, like I mentioned earlier before we start recording, this is one of my favorite topics. Let me see, that should work. So I'm John Walters. I'm a designer at Roche Diagnostics in Santa Clara, where we create solutions for DNA testing and DNA sequencing to improve healthcare. But my topic today is a lot more basic than that stuff. It's about Ben Shneiderman's 8 golden rules of interface design. And if you haven't heard Ben Shneiderman's name, who is Ben Shneiderman? The simple answer is Ben Shneiderman is the gentleman on the left in this picture. He's a distinguished professor of computer science at the University of Maryland. And among many other positions, he was the founding director of that university's Human-Computer Interaction Laboratory from 1983 to 2000. And he's also an author or a co-author of the book, and the people in that photo are his co-authors of the book you see here, Designing the User Interface. This book is now in its 6th edition as per 2016, and the first edition goes all the way back to 1985. And the 8 rules that we'll be talking about tonight were first formulated in that 1985 edition, so they're more than 35 years old. Now we know that UX is a pretty, dare I say, modern, there you go, a modern craft, we think. So why would you look at a book or the rules from a book from 1985? Well, the interesting thing is if you look at user interfaces these days, there is a lot of really dubious design out there, even though our craft has been around for a while. And I sometimes wonder if it has to do with the fact that you get a lot of free advice on the internet, which is typically very short, it completely lacks context, and it's often very difficult to differentiate between proven insights and facts and personal opinion. So in contrast, books provide much more substantial, more long-lived guidance and have a lot more context in terms of both breadth and depth of that context. And also it's fairly easy to find out if a book is worth reading. For example, if you look at the reading lists of human-computer interaction professors at universities, and you see the same book mentioned time and time again, that's usually a pretty good indicator that the book is worth reading and that it's worth your while. And Ben Shneiderman's book, with his co-authors, of course, is one of those books that you will find a lot. So we have a lot of ground to cover. Let's dive right in. The first rule, and I've quoted the verbatim description by Shneiderman here, and I will provide you with a link later on that you can read this up. I just have it here for reference. But for the presentation, I will focus on the rule itself and the essence of that rule. So strive for consistency. The typical thing we think of when we hear consistency is look and feel. What does it look like? How does it behave? But terminology is also extremely important, that we use words that make sense to our users when they look for something, and also workflows. So it's not just individual UI controls, but also how you get certain workflows done in a user interface. Why is consistency so important? Intuitive user interfaces, a lot of companies claim that they build intuitive user interfaces. The problem is they don't exist. Intuitive user interfaces are a complete myth, and here's why. It implies that you can magically understand how a UI works, but in fact, it is all learned. Let me repeat that because it's so important. There are no intuitive user interfaces. It is all learned. That's why consistency is so important, that it reduces the effort of learning a new user interface if you recognize certain workflows, certain controls that you're already familiar with. And it also makes it more reliable and effective to interface with a technical artifact. Let me give you an example. This is a Moog Sub 37 synthesizer. It's an electronic musical instrument. If you've never seen this thing before, or even anything like it, if you look closely at the user interface, you will still see that the majority of UI controls are rotary knobs, push buttons, and indicator lights. So you would at least know how these objects behave, that you push the buttons or you can rotate the knobs. Why do you know that? Because it's a fundamental, very common user interface to have a rotary knob or a toggle switch or a push button. If you play the piano or maybe an organ or another musical instrument that has a keyboard, you recognize that the synthesizer also has a keyboard. So if you're familiar with playing a piano, you will be familiar with that synthesizer, will be able to play it. Even if you're not able to get a sound out of that thing, but if it's programmed to make a sound, you can play a tune on that instrument. If you look at similar products in the same product category, and you've ever interfaced, so to speak, with an electronic musical instrument, you might recognize the same functional blocks. So this is an instrument from another manufacturer, but inching ever closer, you might have used another product by the same manufacturer. So in a way, you can think of this keyboard up here as the application, could also be like a piece of software, etc. And then there are several tiers of consistency and familiarity. And if you look at this world, to me, is something like a rotary dial or a switch, very fundamental stuff. Then you have cultural techniques like playing a keyboard, speaking, writing. Then you have a product category. This, as another example, could be a mobile phone or a tablet. And a platform could be something like Android or iOS. So the further you move from left to right in these images, the closer you get to that interface in terms of familiarity and consistency with what I call the application here, the Mockup 37. It's not just how you interact with these controls that you know that a knob is rotating. It's also that you have learned, and there's that word again, learned expectations, what the response of that artifact is. So the expected outcome, for example, of a rotary knob is that when you turn it clockwise, it means more. Whatever that knob controls, think of volume on your stereo in the car or maybe at home. When you turn it clockwise, that means the music or whatever you're listening to becomes louder. Similarly, at least in the Western world where we write from left to right, moving a slider from left to right means you move towards more. Same thing if you move it from the bottom towards the top, that means more. And similarly, typically, if you look at switches, even light switches in your home, typically if you move the switch upwards, it means light is on. If you move it downwards, it means light is off. So these are expectations about the outcome of an interaction with these controls that is learned. And if designers or whoever builds something screw this up, just think of the example of a hotel room shower. If you expect the temperature knob to get warmer when you turn it clockwise, but it actually gets warmer when you turn it counterclockwise, and you step in and it's too hot and you want to get it colder, that's often a nasty surprise. So these three controls that I show here are still very close to what you would find in the physical world, like switches or fader sliders, etc. But there are also some controls that are purely digital that also come with certain expectations. For example, if you look at the bottom right of this window here, the list of checkboxes. Checkboxes, we have learned, mean that you can freely combine on and off states in a group of checkboxes. So if you repeatedly click a checkbox, that one box is toggled on or off, but it doesn't affect any other boxes in that group. In contrast, radio buttons means there is exactly one selection at any time. And you see checkboxes, square, radio buttons, circle. That is learned expectations that's how these controls behave. And breaking these conventions makes it harder for users to interact with that user interface. So if you break these conventions, you better have a really good reason to do so. But it's not just the individual controls, it's also workflows. So if you copy something from one location to another, it's always the same order of things. You select the source, you trigger the copy command, you select the destination, you trigger the paste command. And this order of steps is identical no matter what platform you use in terms of computers, for example. It's the same on Windows, the same on macOS, the same on iOS, etc. So that's rule number one. Because we have so much to cover, let's look at rule number two already. Seek universal usability. When we hear universal usability, typically people think of accessibility as in make something usable for people who have what we call disabilities, which is an unpleasant term, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. But there are other ranges of, let's say, experience that you should design for making a piece of software or another technical artifact usable for people who are just starting out, that are newbies, but also make it focused on effectivity for power users. And there are several ranges of these abilities that people bring to your user interface. So like I said, the accessibility is a key aspect of this. However, it's actually so important. I will not dive deeper into this because that's its own topic. I wouldn't do it justice. I will, however, mention one book that is just, it's eye-opening. Because often we talk about abilities or lack of abilities, when what we're really looking at are mismatches between people's abilities and skills and expectations and what the user interface provides. So it's not so much about abilities, it's matching a UI to what lets people use the product. I just mentioned newbies and power users. Very simple example. Typically, when we explore a new piece of software, in this case, desktop application, we peruse the menus. We look at which commands are available, and they're explicitly listed as in, there's a principle called recognition over recall. What that means is instead of memorizing which commands are available, you go through the user interface and you recognize things in that user interface. In this case, for example, you see cut, copy, paste. So you don't have to memorize that these commands exist. You can find them as, if you will, implicit documentation in that menu. Over time, you will also see the command shortcuts here. So instead of going to the mouse, opening the menu, picking copy, you will habitually start using Command C and Command V for copy and paste. There is a third tier beyond that, and that is if you look at the bottom here, and I hope this will work over Zoom, that you can actually click and drag text from one window to another, so there's no keyboard involved, there's no menu involved, and drop it into the destination. The latter technique is something you see a lot in media applications. And I think most of you are designers, if you use something like Sketch or Figma, you hold the Option key and you drag an object, that creates a copy of that object. That's one of these power user shortcuts. So speaking from my own experience, I mix and match these three techniques all the time. If I learn a new piece of software, I'll look at the menus. Eventually, I get to use the keyboard shortcuts, etc. This makes it a lot easier for a broad range of users to learn the software and also over time to become really effective in interacting with that piece of software. Next up is offer informative feedback. It's absolute key that the system, whatever the system is, typically a computer in our case, presents the system status to the user. It's like a conversation. You trigger a command and the computer lets you know that they have understood what you wanted to do. What's important is it has to be comprehensible and meaningful to the user, not to the tech writer, not to the developer, not to the designer. It has to be comprehensible and meaningful to the user. It has to reflect the importance and urgency with which the feedback is provided. So it has to appear at the right time and in the right place. One example is if you are low on, or if your computer is running low on battery, it makes sense that the computer tells you, look, you're at 10%, you should better plug in because otherwise you run out of power and you will not be able to use this device anymore. However, imagine that you're charging your computer and it would give you a modal dialog for every 5% that it has charged the battery. That will be really disruptive, and it is not as important and urgent that it would do that. Run out of battery, makes sense to tell you, but if you're charging, I think you're fine. In terms of feedback that the system provides, there are three fundamental, let's call them human deadlines, that are built into how our brain works. And these are the three orders of magnitude for these deadlines. There is a 1/10 of a second, 1 second, and 10 seconds. What do these reflect? 0.1 second is the perception of cause and effect. If I clap into my hand like this, if you hear the clap within about a 1/10 of a second of seeing it, your brain thinks, oh, that clap made the sound. These two are one event. If it's more than 0.1 of a second, you will perceive these as two separate events. Why is it important? Because this 1/10 of a second is the time within which the computer has to respond, for example, to a keyboard input, to a mouse click. Otherwise, there is a lag and it just feels weird. How about 1 second? 1 second is about the time we take when taking turns in the conversation. So that's when the system should summon a progress indicator, or if you open an empty window, if you open a new window to start a new text document, that shouldn't take longer than about a second. If it does, you wonder if the computer has crashed or if there's another issue. And finally, 10 seconds is the typical human attention span. And that's about the maximum time for one step of the task to finish, or for the system response to finish. Let me give you an example. Don't want to make this too abstract. If you print something on a printer, let's use a slightly old school example. If you send something to the printer, you expect it to spin up the printing engine. You know, you've probably all heard that sound. You send something to the printer and it kind of spins up. If that takes longer than 10 seconds, you probably walk over to see if the printer is switched on or not. What's key about these three timeframes is they're built into our brains. That's how our brains work. And whenever we design something, because we focus on interaction design, we have to take this into consideration because we design for the human brain. This is a constraint that we can't freely change. We have to work within it. The staples of informative feedback are things like dialog boxes, are things like progress bars. And they typically appear in response to a user action. But it's not just visual. Think of a click of a hardware button. If you, for example, interact with a button in your car, maybe there is a confirmation sound that you get, a feedback that you have successfully triggered a command via that control. Error beep, very common. Tactile, maybe you have worked with a rotary knob and it had this rasterization, so it's not completely fluid, but you have certain predefined settings of that knob. That is important feedback too. It's not just visual. So what I just showed you is, like I said, response to user action. It doesn't have to be as prominent as these dialog boxes. It can also be status information that is just a glance away. So it's always there, but it's never in the way. And if you use a Mac, this is what you see typically in the top right of your menu bar. It's similar to what you see in the, I think it's called the status tray and on Windows, in which case it's the bottom right corner typically of your screen. And there's a lot of information there that is, like I said, always available, but it's not in your face. So for example, just by looking at it, I can see that I took this image on the 10th, that my audio is on, but not at a high volume, and that the battery is charged. And it's just a glance away. This is a great example for showing feedback as built-in user guidance. If you look closely, you will see that there are these tiny squares, 8 tiny squares along the edges of this image. The existence of these squares alone provides status feedback, because that means that this image is selected, that you clicked on it. So if, for example, you would hit the delete key, you would delete that image. But there's more to this. If you hover the mouse pointer over these so-called handles, the shape of the mouse pointer changes from the typical arrow to these double arrows. So that indicates you can resize the image by dragging. If you combine this with a modifier key, in this case, the max command key, it actually changes the interaction from resizing to rotating. And if you look closely, you see that this is actually reflected in the shape of these cursors, or the mouse pointers rather. And what's really nifty, the moment you start rotating the image, the handles are hidden because you have grabbed that photo or that image, and a little indicator shows up that shows you exactly what degree the image has been rotated. So that is a great example for showing meaningful information in the right context when the user needs it. Next rule, design dialogues to yield closure. That might sound a little bit cryptic, but what it means is that actions are grouped so that the user has the perception of working in certain steps through a workflow, and completing one step of that workflow means that they're now open to understand what options do I have now that I have completed one of those steps. And the typical example is something like this. If you close a window with unsaved changes, then you get this dialog box. It is modal versus the document, so you cannot change the document anymore. And there are exactly 3 meaningful options for taking action at this point. You can save the changes. You can decide not to save the changes, or you can cancel the operation and go back to that document window. By the way, and this is the nice thing about Shneiderman's rules, you see them applied in the same, so several rules applied in the same context in very many situations. In this case, for example, you see that one button looks different than the others. So that's an intentional breaking of the rule of consistency, because that is the default button. Here's another example. If you look at a book, by the way, this is an awesome book. I hope that every student of UX design reads that book. It is really important. Although be prepared for some really strong language. On this page, you can see that, again, breaking consistency. The button where it says add to cart stands out. It has a lot of visual prominence. Why? Because that's what this website wants you to do, that you add that book to your cart. There's one thing on the right, add to wish list. So the 2 most likely things you want to do by looking at this book on the site is, well, you add it to your wish list for later consideration, or you add it to your cart now. And if you do click add to cart, there are 2 logical things you could do as a next step. You want to check out if that's the only book you want to buy and be done with the entire purchase process, or you say, no, let me keep shopping. I'll look for some other books as well. So 2 meaningful options at this point. So by the time you click one of these, you have completed this process. You've added this book to the cart. What's more, if you look closely here, the button that used to say add to cart now says in cart, informative feedback. There's no more need for you to add it to the cart because that's where it is already. Next, prevent errors. This is about mainly error prevention over error correction. Of course, you have to have meaningful error messages if there is no way to prevent certain, I don't want to say user errors because that shouldn't happen in the first place, but if an error occurs that the user is informed about it, but better yet, prevent them. Here's an example how not to do this. This is a government website. I will not blame the agency behind it, but the phone number, we all love fields not, where the system requires a certain format for input. In this case, it's a phone number. So you'd think, well, how many formats are there? I type this phone number in here. There's no other information on the page. But when I tap out of the field, it actually gave me an error message. I mean, it's a reasonably useful error message because it says it must only be digits. But if there is a requirement for entering data in a certain format, show it before I enter that format or before I enter that data. Don't let me guess what the system is expecting. And I think it's never a good idea to shame a user for entering data in the wrong format. Here's an example of how to do this a lot better. This is let's call it a micro interaction that I really love. This is from the Apple Contacts app, which is basically an address book app on the Mac. The way this works is you enter a phone number, in this case only digits, and because the system is set to the locale United States, it formats it for me. So it just takes my input and it cleans it up for me. It doesn't say you're supposed to enter it in the following format and you made a mistake. It doesn't shame me. Better yet, it also recognizes country codes and area codes. In this example, 49 is the area code for the country code for Germany, and it actually formats the number appropriately. You see, it doesn't use parentheses, for example. It doesn't use dashes, which is fairly uncommon in Germany. And here's a nice detail, by the way. The 241 is the area code, but the length of area codes in Germany can differ. So somewhere in that application, they have to have a list of the actual area codes that it knows how to properly format and group the digits in the number. And speaking of stuff that doesn't really make sense, +44 is the area, the country code for the United Kingdom. And I just added these random dashes in there. When I tab out of the field, it fixes it for me. I want to see this in every field that requires a certain format for data entry. If it's a website, if it's a native application, you know, for credit card numbers, for phone numbers, etc. There is just no excuse that the user has to fix it for the system. It just doesn't make sense. Another example from, let's call it the real world. This is a door in a parking garage in Germany. And it's a door that is on the exit path. So if there's an emergency and you have to evacuate the building, you have to walk through this door. And you have to walk through it in the direction that you're looking at right now. Because there's only a push bar, your brain doesn't have to decide, do I have to pull the door open or do I have to push the door open? It is physically impossible to pull this door because there's no handle. So by designing it this way, it reduces the cognitive load, especially in a situation where you might have to leave that building quickly in an emergency.
Where's the hinge?
Great question. I heard that. This is brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm not sure who said that, but you cannot see the hinge. This is awesome. Who said this? Who was it?
I think it was me. I didn't even realize I was not muted. I'm sorry.
But that is brilliant thinking. Actually, I typically explain, I'm just looking at the time. I don't want to go over, but the way to solve this could be, because you don't see the hinge, so do you push on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side? So there's a little bit of an indicator. If you look at the right edge of the door, there's this little plate that covers what would usually be the keyhole. So there's a little bit of an indicator, and the position of that sticker, which says drücken, which means push in German. The way to, the way to solve this would be have a non-symmetrical push plate. If the push plate would be half as wide and only on one side, it would instantly scream, hey, push on this side of the door. But that was an awesome comment. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Next rule, permit easy reversal of action. So one thing is to tell the user that they might have made a mistake or that they have to fix a certain thing or to prevent errors. But there's another aspect that when you start exploring a new application, it really helps if the user knows I can take a step back, I can interact with the system, I can undo what I did, because that gives them more freedom and reduces anxiety for them to just freely explore and see what an application has to offer. What's more, there is no interference with the user flow. Imagine that you type a text document and you try to capture your stream of thoughts and you want to just type it down. Now imagine that every time you edit something by deleting text, it would show a modal dialog box and say, are you sure you want to delete this piece of text? This can't be undone. That would be extremely disruptive. So instead, by knowing that you can type and then you go, oh, I didn't want to delete that, and you undo the deletion, that gives you a lot more freedom to focus on what you want to do instead of focusing on what the system expects from you. And of course, the obvious, or I shouldn't say obvious, because let's say the common solution is that in the edit menu, you find an undo command. In this case, you also find a redo command. And as a nice touch, it lists which action you undo or redo. So you don't have to remember what you just did. It just says undo, copy, and drag. There's a nifty feature in this application. This is a music application, and it has an undo history. So instead of stepping through individual undo and redo steps, it actually has a window that lists your most recent interactions with the software. And by clicking undo and redo, you can step up and down through that list. And you can even immediately click on one of these items. And that's how you get back to an earlier state of the document that you're working with. And if you use an application like Figma or Abstract as a designer, then you know that for, let's say, professional level applications, there's often very smart autosave. So in this case, this is a screenshot from Figma where it says 4 autosave versions. So we probably all been there that we kind of habitually do this Command S so we don't lose our work. In this case, what Figma does is, I don't know what the algorithm is, but it at regular intervals, more or less, it saves a copy of your document. So if you make any mistakes or inadvertently delete something, you can always go back to an earlier version. And to take that even to the next level, I hope you can see that towards the bottom, it says new branch, testing missing component issue created. What that does is, this is something that comes from version control in development. It creates a copy of the document. You can freely explore that copy. And if you think that what you did in that copy you want to keep, you can apply the changes to the main version of that file, which is called merging. And there's even conflict resolution if maybe somebody else has modified the main file so that it says, oh, there are 2 conflicting changes. How would you like to resolve these? So what that means is you have a copy and you don't have to worry about losing any data or destroying data that others might be working with. And you can just freely explore. And then if you think it's worth it, you merge it back. And if you don't think it's worth it, well, you archive it. This used to be my favorite rule of the bunch because it had this really cool name, and it used to be called support internal locus of control. What that meant was it support the internal, as in the user's internal locus of control. So what that meant was user is in control and the system obeys. So what that means is if I interact with the system, it should accommodate that I call the shots. On a related note, there's this principle of least surprise. Maybe you've heard of it, but if you interact with a system, because we have these learned expectations, the system should respond in a way that meets those expectations. I should not try something like, oh, that's weird. I didn't see that coming, because that violates the principle of least surprise. And the very hands-on example is if you have a process that takes a certain amount of time, as you can see here with the progress bars. In both dialogues here, you have a cancel or a stop button. So I don't have to wait until this process completes. I am in control as the user to say, dear computer, abort that process. I don't want that to happen anymore. You don't have to wait for the machine to then undo it. You can tell the machine right now, stop it right there. This, by the way, is also related to designing dialogues to yield closure. As a user, you should see the relevant actions that you can find closure for a certain step in the workflow. As an example, the dialog box on the left, for example, is verifying a file that I downloaded. I can skip that validation step. So cancel would mean I will not open the file, and skip means just skip the verification, open it right away. Timeouts. Timeouts are an absolute pet peeve of mine. There are 2 good reasons for timeouts. One is safety and security. Imagine that you walk away from your desk and you forget to lock your computer. Somebody else walks by, they have access to the data on your machine. You don't want that. So there's a good reason to have a timeout that a screensaver kicks in that requires a password to unlock the machine, maybe after 5 minutes, after 10 minutes. That's a good use of a timeout. The other good use of a timeout is to save energy. That maybe a screensaver kicks in and actually switches off the panel in your monitor to save energy. Those two make sense. Otherwise, if the system does something after a certain wait period without the user telling the system to do that, that violates this rule of keep users in control. And this dialog here, it's a little bit older, but what I did was I wanted to purchase postage for a package online. I had entered my sender's address. I had entered the recipient's address. I had entered the details of the package, like the size and the weight and all that. And for some reason, I was sidetracked. When I get back to the site, it says new shopping cart. This took too long. You shouldn't have taken it. It's like shaming the user yet again. And I had to start over. Why? Why did the system not remember this for me? I don't even know what the good reason would be for a timeout at that point. What I was thinking at this, when I looked at this slide again, imagine if instead of saying new shopping cart, it would have said enter the zip code of the recipient, as in a piece of information that you know because you entered it previously, and then it would unlock the stuff you had entered previously, so you don't have to start over. One more rule, reduce short-term memory load. You might have heard this rule of thumb that our working memory can keep 4 ± 1 chunks of information in it. It used to be 7 ± 2, but more recent research shows it's actually less than that. What's a chunk of information? If you think of a phone area code, like 415 is the area code for San Francisco. If you memorize that, a chunk of information, if somebody gives you your phone number and says, I live in San Francisco, then that would be a chunk of information. What I would like to do at this point is a little experiment. Listen closely, and you might even want to close your eyes. I'm going to read something to you, see if you can process it. Understanding a simple sentence can, if interrupted with a tangent like this one, which contains just 20 words, but already noticeably challenges your short-term memory, become really difficult. So this is what I just read out to you. If I hide this tangent, understanding a simple sentence can become really difficult. Most people that I read this out to had a bit of a challenge to put these two half sentences together because of that tangent, because your working memory is already is already reaching its limits, how much it can remember to bridge the gap between these two half sentences. Why is that relevant for user interface design? If you look at your typical e-commerce page, there's a lot of stuff you typically have to enter. You have to select the product you want to order. You have to select the shipping method, etc. And by just letting the user know at what step in the process they are, you kind of take them by the hand and reduce the workload for the short-term memory. This also relates again to design dialogues to yield closure, so that you have these chunks of information that you process while interacting with the site. What Shneiderman also wrote in his description of that rule is that you don't have to re-enter information that you have previously entered. You don't have to take information from one screen to another. What I think is related to this, and here's another pet peeve of mine, is what I call truncation hell. This is a screenshot from the music application in iOS. And if you look at the top 3 tracks, they have identical track names. The tracks 4 to 6, identical track names. 7 and 8, identical yet again. Because the designer decided the text goes onto a single line, and if it's longer than that, we'll just chop it off. If I want to see the full name of any of these tracks and see, for example, what the tempo is for the given movement of this concerto, I have to tap this play control down here, which shows which track is playing right now. And then I go to this screen. And I still can't see the title in its entirety. That's because there's this also nice and also delight-inducing marquee animation so that the title of the track moves from right to left. And then you see, oh, that's movement number 4 in Allegro. There is so much space on that screen. I think there is no excuse to not just simply show that information in its entirety. To show a better example than this is from an application called Overcast, which is a podcast application. And you see the list of episodes of this podcast at the bottom. If you look at that list, you see that the title of an episode can have 1 or 2 lines of text. And then there are the first couple of words of the description of that episode, and that too takes up 1 or 2 lines. In a way that there's 3 lines total, and it can adapt so that the height of an episode item in that list is still identical. So this nicely combines an eye-pleasing regular layout without sacrificing information by chopping it off. And a detail here that is really interesting, there are no play controls. The play controls appear when you actually tap on an episode. So this bar that shows up here with the turquoise play controls, that space that this bar takes up is saved until you decide what episode you want to listen to. So it creates more room for the list of episodes itself. This very obviously was just a very short look at Ben Shneiderman's 8 golden rules of interface design. And I only could show you very few examples, but I still hope that you're at least intrigued by how these very basic and very timeless guidelines can help you craft more usable user interfaces. Thanks. Let's have some questions.
Was excellent. Thank you so much for going through that. Does anybody have any questions that you want to ask, or you can put it into the chat?
You know, it's interesting. You know, you're showing us things that are really, really important. And in some way, we take them all for granted. Mm-hmm. But in another way, we know that we shouldn't. It really leaves a cause for thinking about this. We have a question here. So the primary use case dash listening dash is placed into a secondary interface to account for a larger list interface. Oh, Mark, I don't even know what you said.
Oh, yeah. Yes. So I think, Mark, you're referring to the Overcast podcasting app. So the moment you tap on an item in the episode list, that's when it shows the play bar beneath the episode you just tapped. So it appears in context. And then when you start play, it has another screen. I see that might be a little bit challenging because it's maybe not as discoverable as if the bar would be showing at all times. But I'd say that, so I'm not sure if this is actually your question, but I think it's easy enough to explore that and learn that and then memorize, because again, it just happens by tapping on it. Was that your question? Do you want to come on audio, Mark? Now see, you're not muted, but I can't hear what you're saying. Is there a follow-up in the chat maybe?
No. Okay.
It's not on video either, so.
Okay, let's check in with Susan. She says, I'm interested in talking about why. Oh, Mark posts apparently audio issues on Zoom interfaces. Okay. Susan She's from San Antonio. She says, I'm interested in talking about why we are lowering the accepted capacity of short-term memory. Is it because we have better tests and studies? Is this a trend?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's better tests and studies. Actually, I'm not entirely sure, but I think I read somewhere that the original research on this with the 7 plus minus 2, I think it's referred to as Miller's law, that
Yep.
some people said that it was actually intended as kind of a joke. I mean, the entire research paper, I'm not quite sure about that, but this 4 plus minus 1 is from a book by Professor Barbara Oakley. I'm not sure what research she is referring to, but that seems to be the rule of thumb for what we know these days. So
And how
it's
do you-
not a trend. It's not a trend.
How do you spell her name? Barbara?
Let me see if I can find it here.
And I thought that's interesting because I know that that study was used in making telephone numbers back in the day.
Right.
So.
It's this one.
We have some
It's
folks from
called,
AT&T in our group.
Mhm.
Oh, cool.
So
So the book is called A Mind for Numbers, and Oakley is Oakley.
Okay, thank
Barbara
you.
Oakley.
So let's talk a little bit more about trends, though, because as someone who has had a long, storied career in UX, have you seen trends toward less tolerance for complexity and length of experiences?
Yes. Two things on that. A trend that I did read about, and unfortunately I can't point to a hard study on this, but this 10-second attention span used to be kind of the accepted number as a ballpark. And some people claim it's going down to 6 to 8 seconds. And
Right.
that is a massive change. That's not how evolution should usually work. It usually should take longer than that. The other thing is, I talked to some developers recently, and they said they have a hard time because a lot of junior developers don't know how to structure files for code anymore. As in, they're so used to searching for stuff that their experience with sorting things in a meaningful way, with organizing things. Think of information architecture, that they just don't have that experience anymore. They search for stuff, they dump it all in one location. And that might be related to what you're referring to, that people's expectations change measurably so.
Yep. The use of navigation has changed over my career.
Yeah.
And I think we're both getting better at making experiences more human friendly, but also I think the attention span, in my opinion, is going down. And I suspect that it's related to the barrage of information and the distraction culture that we all cultivate by holding our, favorite screens to our faces so much of the time. So.
Yeah, I think
both myself.
Yeah, that's why I would say that's part of the motivation for this talk, that speaking from my own experience, it typically takes me 10 to 15 minutes when I start reading a book to really kind of calm down and kind of get into that comprehension mode, because there are so many other thoughts that drag me into all kinds of directions. And if I imagine what it's like to just get your, dare I say, education about anything in these small little snippets without context, that is just too much for me. So immersing myself in a good book, I find that so much more satisfying, because then I make connections and I can see how stuff comes together, how it's related to other things. But yeah, it takes practice to get to the point again where the brain just says, you know what, we're going to read for 30 minutes versus, you're reading for a minute, let's do something else. Right? It's exactly like what you said, Susan. Totally agree.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I have a hard time with skipping rocks across the top of the river. I don't learn anything doing that way. I've got to dig in. Yeah, it can stick in my head so much better if I'll spend 4 hours on a weekend in one sitting and just pay attention, and then I can chew on it all week.
Mhm.
just, it's in the back of my head, just chewing,
Exactly.
and it
Yes,
really
exactly.
stays. It'll stay for 20, 30 years that way. Whereas if I'm
Mhm.
just skipping a rock across the top and I'm popping here and popping there, I'm going in a million different directions. It's like the classic thing, multitasking doesn't work. So I'd like to know, which is your favorite principle and why? And if you could give us an example of a moment where something really shined for you, that's so simple. I'm thinking in my imagination, it would be like you just took something for granted, like these rules are just so
Mhm.
obvious that we need these rules, and suddenly you were surprised by something. I don't know what that might be, or if I'm way off track.
I'll give you two related but slightly separate answers. I think my favorite one is consistency, because it supports learning. It makes it easier for people to apply what they already know. And it's one of my topics that I get most riled up about when I see conversations about this. I mean, there are entire websites, like web blogs, that claim that people now know how stuff works and all these visual indicators, like a round radio button versus a square checkbox doesn't matter anymore. And I'm thinking, show me the evidence, show me the research. And someone recently told me, humans' behavior doesn't change quickly. It takes years and years and decades. So why would we throw the learned insights away because we're not pleased with the visuals or whatever? So consistency, because it also creates like a long-term basis. The other thing is, and I'm not really sure why it's the case with this application, but there's a note-taking application out there, and I'll just root for it. It's called Bear, like the animal bear. And what's amazing about that app is I try stuff and it just works the way I expect it to. I don't know how they did this, but it's just gets totally out of my way. And when I say, oh, what if I try this? Would that work? And it works exactly like I expected to. Again, I have no idea how they did this, but I generally love when a designer has achieved a user interface that lets me just get my stuff done. Like it's the opposite of going to a web page where the first thing is, we have cookies, would you allow us to set cookies? And the next thing is sign up for our newsletter. And then the next thing is, oh, GDPR. And there's all these interruptions. And there was a tweet by Andy Budd about this recently. So after all these interruptions, why did I go to that website again? Oh, I totally forgot. That's the opposite.
Yeah. Or the very first thing is an entire privacy page.
Mhm.
With
exactly.
reams of information. Yeah, I've been seeing that more and more.
It's I think we need to build in good manners and etiquette into our experiences. I find myself wanting the spoken word interfaces to reward us for saying thank you, because I think that we will pattern away people saying it.
Mhm.
Oh, that's a good point, because if we're digital natives and those kinds of interactions don't exist, wow. Yeah. My husband.
I often tell Alexa thank you or Siri thank you.
And she said, yeah, she says, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah.
To be honest, when I first did this, or noticed the first couple of times where I did this, when I said, hey Siri, send a message to my wife, whatever. And the voice would say, message sent. Oh, thank you. So, what am I doing? I'm talking to a machine. It's very weird.
But isn't that the way people interact with computers? Research has shown, right, that the dialogue that we're presented with and the feedback, as you talked about, that we're presented with, cue us into whether we're engaging with a machine or a person, a personality. And if the voice,
there's a line of creepiness too.
If the voice,
the uncanny valley. Yeah,
but there's a personality that we're dealing with depending on how, like, I'm a writer. And so if one website is stiff and uppity and, or highly legalese, and another website's, hey, yeah, or my lawyer made me do this, right? You know, so you're gonna engage differently because it's human nature to respond differently with a different social cue.
Yeah. The
But
design
actually,
make also shape the world we live in.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I want us to consider manners and the effect of making certain Jochen, the not including thank you or any kind of reward for thank you is sort of it reinforces a behavior, and I'm not sure everybody makes the distinctions that we make, and it strikes me as the kind of system efficiency decision that I have often argued against when I'm talking to a developer. They like an elegant system. They like super efficient interaction. And I'm pulling for delightful and human.
Right.
But there's trade-offs to both methods, right?
Yeah.
And
I think it's sometimes helpful to think about when you interact with a system and you see certain informative feedback. There you go, like an error message or a confirmation. To just ask yourself, how would I react if a person treated me the way the system treats me or communicates with me? I mean, best example, or maybe a most common example, is if there's an error and it says an error occurred. Okay. Imagine that you go to a store and you say, I want to return this device.
Error.
And you know, that's
rude.
On the other hand, it's what I mean, I'm not sure if it bothers me so much as confuses and surprises me. Whenever we talk among designers about these topics, it seems that we all have a consensus, we have a foundation that we all can work off of. And yet the shipping products, there's so much, I mean, you have some products where you go like, wow, this is really nicely designed on so many levels. But we're still surrounded by so much UX junk. Why is that? We know what the rules are. We agree what the rules should be, what we should aspire to instill.
Do you think that might play a part in, now that we have an adult generation of digital natives, do you think that might play a part in the reduction or the diminishment of civility?
That's a whole series of talks. That's a whole series of talks, Paula.
Because we tend to blame it on the politicians, right?
Yeah.
And the journalists. We tend to it's just the media. Maybe it's not.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a combination of a lot of little things that we haven't put together. I know when I go into my doctor's offices, since I've moved to a big city, it's way different. I feel like I'm being run through a cattle chute. I really, really do.
Right.
I really do. Compared to back home in the country, look me in the eyes. I can get everything done in one visit. Here in the city, I'm required to come to 3 visits a year, 3 to get an annual physical exam. 3 visits required. You're not even allowed to schedule them in the same day. So these processes and these systems, that's healthcare insurance and greedy doctors and maybe shipping apps and all these different systems that we're interacting with, and we're getting frustrated here and frustrated there, and we're having error messages backed at us, and we're distracted. We've got all these pressures going on. Our attention's divided more and more and more. Maybe that is part of why we have this hotter reaction time when it comes to impatience compared to in the past. It isn't just the journalists and the politicians.
Denise, capitalism. That's right.
Yeah, I think that one major part in this is that at least the majority of social media sites reward the most outrageous behavior because that gets the most views, that gets the most engagement, which is also the reason. which is also the reason why I prefer to work on SaaS applications. Conversion rate is a complete non-starter for me. I don't look for engagement. Actually, the quicker people can get their stuff done in my user interfaces that I work on, the more successful my designs are. It's the opposite of trying to keep them in the application for as long as possible. But yeah, I think there's so many factors. Maybe one of the biggest factors is just like you hinted at earlier, Paula, that the sheer amount of information. I think our brains just can't keep pace. There's a German comedian who actually said, think back a couple of 100 years, the only images people saw back then were the paintings in their church. And today we're bombarded with images all the time. And then everything is very close, even if it happens in the farthest away corner of the planet, the image brings it to your home. And so just the barrage of threats that we perceive is just, there's no end to it, which that's why my favorite control on any device is the off button.
Yeah.
Or the sleep button is okay, I'm done.
Close. Close.
Exactly.
Right. We're being overstimulated.
Yes, exactly.
Continually. Yeah. That lack of the longer thinking. If one of my favorite books is Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh gosh, yes, right here. Right.
How do you spell that? Let me get that for everyone.
Type it in the chat.
Neman.
Kneman.
KH. Oh, there it is.
Do this. Of course, the camera thinks maybe I'll take a step back. There it is.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Another really fun one, if you like the Kahneman, is the Undoing Project.
Oh, I hadn't heard
that sounds amazing.
So that is Tversky and Kahneman's love story by the same guy that wrote Moneyball. It's incredible. Incredible.
So the Undoing Project, how is that?
It's so Kahneman was partners with Tversky, Amos Tversky. They're both Israeli. They both came to the U.S. and they study biases and behavioral economics.
Okay.
But the Undoing Project is how they evolved their theories at kind of riffing off each other in kind of the same way. I'm a Beatles fan. So to me, it reminds me of Lennon and McCartney. The way that they're very different personalities, but they had a really unique synergy.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sorry, rabbit hole.
Well, and you're talking about the, thinking long term. I often think about, all these great people from our history that we talk about that were inventors, and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Einstein, because they had hours and hours to think and without disruption. And I'm just wondering how much more we could accomplish in the world if we had that time, instead of distraction and things. So I've thought that many times. But, wow.
Maybe one of the greatest UX inventions was the cotton gin. Have you ever tried to pick cotton? That is a miserable thing. It's awful. And hours and hours of thinking about how I could make this better. Mark Mueller says, building on the comment about information saturation, I'd argue that we've moved to an attention economy and the use of attention as currency, since nothing is free, has other effects beyond the transaction itself.
Yeah, yes. Mark, good audio.
Yeah.
I've been studying Web3. Anybody here getting into Web3?
What is Web3? I keep hearing it and people describe it as it's web plus blockchain. It's like,
yeah,
really?
It has to be blockchain.
It is blockchain.
Yes, of course.
And it has specifically a lot of implications for the attention economy because we can join a podcast app and reward the person who created the podcast with cryptocurrency, but we also can share in the earnings by engagement. So one of the really useful differences that I've heard, I just had Jennifer Navarrete come and talk to the Firecat First Friday group about this, that she said that Web 1 was basically a one-way conversation for most people. It was, brochureware where you're publicizing information. Mm-hmm. And then Web 2 was a dialogue where it empowered consumers to an extent because consumers could now talk back to brands, mm-hmm. And post reviews, for example. And then Web 3 but on Web 2, the people who benefit from our attention are basically the big platforms, Facebook, Google, YouTube, mm-hmm. Et al. But in Web 3, we own the store. We own, and we co-own in a lot of cases, the platforms. So we can benefit from both our attention spent and our creativity expressed. Super interesting. I think it's going to change everything real radically yet again. And it's orders of magnitude more complex.
The amazing thing is that even moving to Web 3 and those concepts that you talked about, Shneiderman's 8 laws apply.
Oh, they sure.
I think because they're wrapped around humanity, and they're not wrapped around profit or anything that a man has built or man or woman, whatever. I'm saying that very generically. They're not wrapped around an edifice that's been invented. They're wrapped around our biology.
Right. And
right?
if as is true, I think machines are smarter than we are and can do things that a human can't do. We can still decide what we want them to do.
But and that's the problem with something like Shneiderman's rules, because Shneiderman's rules are based on cognitive psychology. They guide how to build a good user interface, but they don't represent ethics. I could still use them to build a UI that, like dark patterns to force users to do something that I want and not that they want. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's one of the issues that we have that it kind of dates me, but what I appreciated about when the web really started to take off, like Web 1, mind you, mm-hmm. was that a lot of people started sharing stuff freely. Yes. And the currency was that you would share something as well. And these days, everything has to be monetized. Mm-hmm. For example, one thing that is like, I don't understand. I'm not on Instagram. And sometimes I see that friends of mine post a picture. I click on it, and the first thing I see is sign in. I'm thinking, you don't even own the pictures. How dare you want to make me sign in so I can see someone else's picture? Because
they do
engagement, monetization.
Or at least a license to it. That's in that I agree that we all click
yes
past.
Yes, they do own everything that we put on there. It's interesting.
Either own it or they have
a
license.
Yep.
Yeah, they do. People think that they don't. I just saw an old friend from college. I spent 5 minutes on Facebook earlier today. I don't go there very often, and he had this big long diatribe about how Facebook can't share his stuff, and he owns it, they don't own it, and blah 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 blah. I said to my husband, I said, wow, he is very naive.
Yeah.
All he did was click accept.
Yeah.
Right.
He doesn't understand the nature of the internet or the nature of social media, that it's owned by them. We are visitors and guests. We do not own our information that is on there. We don't. We give it away.
Right. Our information has been monetized for sure.
Yes. Every keystroke is a gift.
Well, and that gift, I feel you on that I do miss that very generous sharing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
it's what we're
Mhm.
doing here. You know,
Right.
Sherry and Paula and I spend a bunch of time, and Adrian
Mhm.
and all of our other volunteers spend a bunch of time and generously share and create these platforms. And I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the sort of relentless monetization of everything.
Mhm.
But what's the alternative? And we need to live too. We should benefit if anybody is going to. But yeah, it does make me still a little uncomfortable.
Right.
I love the conversation that's going on in the chat between Edward and Sherry here. Business needs versus user needs, and then bridge between business needs and user needs.
Yeah,
And
that
then
is
SEO and competition. Yeah.
SEO and competition has hurt sharing. You know, SEO has hurt a lot of things because SEO is written for machines,
Right.
and people forget
Yes.
that it's not
Right.
written for humans. So we're reading.
Just lately, you know, in the last couple of years, has Google actually rewarded SEO for UX practices and you know, making it more usable. So they've just started rewarding for that. And I remember back when you could search, and it depends on how long it's been on the internet. It depends on how, you know, all those kind of things. Then they changed it to the most recent. And then now it's, you know, how user friendly, is it mobile friendly? Is it that
Mhm.
those are factors that are put into the algorithm to show up. So they're a little behind, but at least they're recognizing that.
And I do agree with Edward. Tons of blog spam on Google search results for
Mhm.
years. You know, you can go and search a topic. I do a lot of psych research. I'm in a psych program right now, almost done. And I've had to write these
Cool.
big projects every class and loads of research. And I'll go look on something online and I'll put a phrase in and I will find blog posts just echoing each other. You know, it's
Oh, I read an
What's the
article.
business model behind that?
Right. I read
How
an
do they
article
work?
yesterday that was talking about an article that was written by someone else. And here is the article that you can go read the original one. And I'm like,
Yeah, and it takes you in a great big circle.
what?
Yeah, because people aren't spending enough time reading more than one article before they write a blog post.
They read the title of the article and then
Yeah,
they write the
there
blog
you-
post
there you
about the
go.
article they never read.
because they need the SEO, right? They need another post of 1,500 words with so many keywords and a certain hierarchy. And so I'm glad that UX has been added to the Google rhythm algorithm. Let's all dance. So yeah, I did do a little bit of research on SEO recently, and I learned that on a global level, Google captures over 90% of search traffic around the world. But in the US, it's only about half. I thought that was interesting.
What do you mean they only get half in the US?
Yeah, if you go to Statista, Google captures a lot, but there's a lot that it doesn't capture. And it's about half and it fights. Yeah, it's on Statista.
A lot of what? Like, what's the competition?
I didn't really pay attention to that because guess what? I was writing a blog post.
Okay.
Yeah, I was writing a blog post for a startup.
If I look at any client's search traffic, Google is always the vast majority of the traffic. There's less Bing and then a tiny fraction of the other.
Yes, but I think there are other search like my mom uses DuckDuckGo exclusively.
Mm-hmm.
And she's on the line, she's on the internet all the time. And I have several family members that use DuckDuckGo, and that is not traceable.
Well, harder to trace.
Well, yeah. Not like Google.
I try to stay away from absolutes after
You're right.
You're being proved wrong.
It takes a while to get that out of your
Oh my God, yes.
automated conditioning speech.
Statista.
Yeah.
I have to go look
Statista.
at that.
Yeah, I was writing a blog post on SEO for a little guy that was starting up. here in San Antonio over the winter.
So
You know,
I just want to ask Chuck if you can expand on that, because I've come across people who just want to search, they don't want to look. So what is your experience with that?
I think even if they say they want to search, that's not really their actual goal. And so when I'm I'm a technical writer and I'm designing content systems, and so my goal is to put that information as close to the point of need as possible. Try to anticipate that need and put that as close to where they want to go. And you go to Amazon or to eBay or to bestbuy.com or something like that to do some shopping. You may already be thinking about what you're looking for. Wouldn't it be nice if they could read your mind and put that right in front of you so you don't have to actually search? Because you actually go into a brick and mortar store, and especially one you're familiar with, you go right into Safeway and you go right to the back because you know that's where the milk is because you found it before.
Right.
So you've got some familiarity. And there's a really great little book that talks about this. I don't know if any of you ever read it, called Ambient Findability.
Ooh,
But I want it.
that sounds great.
Yeah, can you put the information, the title and the author in the chat?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
It's, Peter Norville, the same guy who wrote Information Architecture for the World Wide Web.
Yeah, he was the co-author of the Polar Bear book with Lou.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Just
this is
looking.
great.
Let's see. And that's kind of what Google tries to do is when you search, you type a first character or two, and they try to anticipate to help you find.
You're right. I hadn't thought of it that way. And when I
true.
talk about searchability, I really say findability.
Right. Thanks for that.
But everybody, because that's what everybody puts front and center, search. You know, but and
do you think that depends on the information that they're looking for? Because I find, in more technical things and all of that, you're in the middle of something and you need to go right where you need to go, right? But
100%.
But if you're in a more shopping mode or browsing mode or something like that, then you would search or follow a link here and there with the things that are like this, or comparing things and all of that. So but it's strange to me that I even knew a person who was an SEO. She was the person who did the SEO for the company, and she would go and type in the name of the company and do it and then go to the page that she wanted. I'm like, are you kidding me? You're Googling the company that you do the SEO for. It is so crazy to me.
That's kind of what Yahoo tried to do. They tried to create a structure for the entirety of the web that would get people to where they want to go, but also kind of like allow them to browse and show the related stuff as well. And we all know how well that worked out.
But people also come to, I was working at an agency before this. I'm working internally in an enterprise now, but before the agency, everybody wanted their website to be Amazon-like. And I was like, okay, tell me what you mean by that.
It goes back to the models that they're familiar with.
Because Amazon's UX is terrible. It depends on what you're looking for. And that what they meant is usually the comparison and the suggestive things at the bottom.
Yeah.
Being able to compare side by side or find something that's like that. And that's what they're finding it. And I'm like, okay, all the other stuff is, that's not what you're wanting. You're just wanting suggestive cells.
And that's where you really have to, I think, understand what a user's goals really are. I think Alan Cooper talks about this really well in his books. User goals aren't necessarily how to use a product or to check out or something like that. A user's goals may be totally unrelated to a design or something like that. And so it comes back to Jared Spool calls it the scent of information. What are your goals? Are your goals to go and directly find something specific? Are your goals, I'm not sure what I want, but I have some idea, lead me along the way? They're understanding that is A, important, and B, really hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, one detail I noticed that I'm not very fond of is that in essence I see two trends. There are sites, let's say streaming media services, e-commerce sites, and you type in a search term for something that you're interested in. And one kind of system tells you outright if it's not available. The other tells you it might be available in these 500 other search results. So for example, if you go to bookshop.org and you type in a title they don't have, they will show you some titles that might be related, but they will also let you know we don't have that. Same with Barnes & Noble. If you go to Amazon, it doesn't tell you we don't have that title, or maybe it's very small text there. And it's the same thing with Netflix. If you search for a specific movie you want to watch, they don't have this. They will show you a lot of search results, as in, we have something for you because we want to make sure that you spend time with us.
Right.
Instead of just, I mean, we don't have that. What's that? Sorry?
Don't go anywhere else. It's the business needs edging
Yes.
out the user's needs there.
You know, I